Welcome to the Macmillan Report. I'm Marilyn Wilkes, your host, and our guest is Hilary Mann Leverett, a senior fellow at the Jackson Institute for Global Affairs at Yale and CEO of Stratega, a political risk consultancy that focuses on international energy and financial markets. She has served in the State Department and at the National Security Council at the White House during the George H.W. Bush, Clinton, and George W. Bush administrations. In the George W. Bush administration, Ms. Leverett worked as the Director for Iran, Afghanistan, and Persian Gulf Affairs at the National Security Council, as Middle East Specialist on the Security of States Policy Planning Staff, and as Political Advisor for Middle East and Central Asian issues for the U.S. Mission to the United Nations. Today we'll talk with Professor Leverett about Iran and the future of American power. Welcome, Professor Leverett.
Thank you for having me.
You currently are working on a book with your husband, Flint Leverett, called Going to Tehran, Iran and the Future of American Power. Tell us a bit about it and what's its premise.
Well, the Going to Tehran part of it takes on what I would call many myths that maybe even most Americans have about Iran, both its foreign policy and its domestic politics. So the Going to Tehran is really to take you to Tehran, into the decision-making, the thought process, both in terms of foreign policy and domestic politics inside the Islamic Republic. The second piece of the title, and the Future of American Power, makes a policy argument that if you do a sober analysis of Iran's foreign policy strategy and a really clear understanding of its domestic politics, you come to the conclusion that the United States needs to deal with the Islamic Republic as it is, that it's going to be an enduring political order in the region for some time, and that for the United States to maintain, if not restore, its credibility in the Middle East, it needs to have a fundamentally more constructive relationship with the Islamic Republic as it is. And in order for the United States to retain its global power, the United States must have a more credible position in the Middle East, which the book makes this policy argument. One of the only ways the United States can do that today is to have a more constructive relationship with the Islamic Republic of Iran.
Why do you feel it's important to write the book?
Coming back to my first point, that I think most of what most Americans think they know about Iran is wrong. I think it's critically important at this point in time to write a book that takes on each of the myths that we have about the Islamic Republic. In particular, there's a policy reason to do so, a broader reason to do so, which is that in the lead up to the invasion of Iraq in 2003, it took many years for the American political dynamic, American political elites, to get to the position where not only the invasion of Iraq the decision to invade Iraq was taken, but with so much American political elite buy-in from the opposing political party, the Democratic political party at the time, within Congress, among academics even, among the media. There was a broad-based buy-in to invade Iraq, based on what we found out later to be a lot of very faulty and unquestioned assumptions about Iraqi politics, about Iraqi leadership, Iraq's position in the Middle East. Those same questions, I think, those questions and assumptions about how we view the Islamic Republic of Iran need to be taken now. We need to question our fundamental assumptions about the Islamic Republic in a way that we did not in the lead up to the war in Iraq, because I think we are on a trajectory toward conflict with the Islamic Republic. So two of the most important examples I think we need to take on, two of the most important assumptions we need to take on, is first in terms of foreign policy. There's a widely held assumption that Iran is an ideologically immature, irrational polity that cannot take decisions based on its material state national interests. Well, I'm one of the very few American officials that had the opportunity to deal with, to negotiate with Iranian officials, because we don't have a diplomatic relationship and because of the antagonism between the United States and the Islamic Republic. The U.S. government essentially forbids its diplomats from dealing with Iranian officials. So very few American officials had the opportunity to even speak to Iranian officials. So they don't really have any first-hand information, understanding about Iran's strategic dilemmas, their national security concerns, their legitimate interests. Because of my work on Afghanistan, I was authorized to deal with my Iranian counterparts on the narrow issue of Afghanistan and al-Qaeda, but it opened a tremendous door for me in terms of Iranian national security, decision-making, thinking, context. So one of the things the book will bring is that perspective that very few Americans have, that Iranian diplomats and the infrastructure, the foreign policy and national security infrastructure in Iran can take and do take over and over again decisions based on Iran's national interest, that we can deal with them in terms of their national interest. Then the other example is in terms of its domestic politics. There's a widely held assumption in the United States that Iran is some sort of fragile political order, just waiting to collapse or implode. So if there's a demonstration, we think this is evidence that the government there is going to fall, and it will inaugurate some new political order that inevitably will be more secular, more democratic, and more pro-American. I take on a lot of those assumptions to really make the argument that the revolution, the Islamic revolution that occurred in the late 1970s, was a fundamental turn in Iran's identity and its political order domestically, and that for 30 years, the Iranians inside Iran have really built a very stable, durable political order, in a sense analogous to what happened in the People's Republic of China, or even some of my Iranian colleagues would say, like what happened with the revolution in France. That the revolution in Iran was just as important to the change in Iran's identity in its regional context, and that the United States needs to come to terms with the fact that that political order is going to be the political order in Iran for quite some time. And just as we came to terms with the People's Republic of China and reoriented our relationship with the People's Republic of China fundamentally in the early 1970s when Nixon went to China, that's where the Going to Tehran title comes from, that we need to fundamentally reorient our relationship with the Islamic Republic of Iran. And not necessarily that Obama needs to fly to Tehran, but we need to, in terms of our thinking about Iran, really come to terms with the reality of the Islamic Republic, what that means for how they act in terms of their foreign policy, and what that means in terms of their domestic political order.
Why do you think we're not doing that today, and why do these myths perpetuate?
This is one of the most surprising and interesting aspects that I think I've come across in writing the book and researching the book. I think it has less to do about what goes on inside Iran than it has to do with us here in the United States, both in terms of our political culture, political elites, academia, the media. And I think it could come down to maybe one idea in particular, the idea of American exceptionalism, that we have these big ideas, from Manifest Destiny to many other, to the Cold War, many big ideas, and that somehow everybody would want to be like us, and people try to be like us, and the inevitable process of modernization will transform countries to be like us if they only had the chance. This is something that I think is really ingrained in our political culture. And only when we're forced to, or when we have, I think, great statesmanship, can we really change that dynamic. Now, with Nixon, as controversial a president as he was, the opening to China really was a mark of great statesmanship. He took the decision for the opening to China at a time when we needed to get out of Vietnam. We had the superpower conflict with the Soviet Union. And he saw the United States as a power in relative decline at the time, economically, militarily, politically. We're in a similar situation today. And what I find the most challenging aspect of the ideas that I'm putting forward in the book is, can we have statesmanship akin to what Nixon did with China, where we realize, we understand, we come to terms with the fact that the United States is a power in relative decline. And how do we stop the hemorrhaging, maintain our position of credibility and power, and maybe even build on that? We're not going to be able to do it through through political superiority or hegemony, or economic superiority or hegemony. We're trying to do it a bit with the military in Iraq and Afghanistan, but it's not going very well. We need to really have a fundamentally different construct to figure out how to come to terms with important regional players, whether that's Turkey, whether that's Iran. It's very difficult for us to do so, I think, particularly because of our political culture, this idea of American exceptionalism, but also because of ingrained, entrenched domestic interest groups that I think are amplified in our political system, not only because of our heritage and our history, but because of our relative security, which makes the voice of interest groups, as important as they are in any context, have even a bigger voice in our domestic context. So we have both the big ideas issue, American exceptionalism, and almost the small ideas, the interest groups, coming together in a very powerful way to constrain the United States from taking steps and opportunities that I think are to me, very obviously in the U.S. interest.
Okay, let's talk about the methodology you're using to write the book. How are you doing the research?
Well, the first piece of the research and what I'm trying to pull together are a lot of my own experiences, drawing from my own experiences in dealing with and talking to Iranian officials, both Iranian diplomats as well as senior Iranian officials across the political spectrum in Iran. From the, we call them, just for shorthand, kind of the conservatives or the hardliners to the more reformists and so-called moderates. It's a very simplistic kind of portrayal of the political system there. But essentially, just to give you an idea of the range of contexts at I think at a high level throughout Iran that I developed, starting with my official negotiations with them and talks with them over Afghanistan and Al-Qaeda in the wake of 9/11. Starting with that, but developing it from 2001 to the present. So I've had nearly 10 years of working on this consistently, constantly over time to really try to develop an understanding of their security concerns, their decision making, and to really bring that into the book. As I mentioned, one of the most distorting aspects of the U.S. debate about Iran is that we never hear either the official interpretation or justification or idea about something, nor do we really hear from people who support the Islamic Republic. We hear about various dissidents and people who have had problems, people who have emigrated, but we never hear from the tens of millions of Iranians who are still in Iran, and many of whom, if not most of whom, support the Islamic Republic, even if they don't necessarily support the person in President Ahmadinejad. I would argue that the vast majority still support the idea of the Islamic Republic. Let me give you an example of one of the things that I found just doing the research and drawing on my personal experiences. No matter how many books people read on Iran, rarely does it come out that in the political system in Iran, the president is term limited. But this is something in my discussions with Iranian officials that would come out, whether it was dealing with the issue of President Ahmadinejad, or before him, President Khatami, who was more of a reformist figure, seen as a little bit more in line with Western ideas of modernization. In both cases, Iranian diplomats would talk about, or Iranian officials from across the political spectrum, would talk about the national interest for the Islamic Republic. And if someone would mention, well, but President Ahmadinejad said this, or President Khatami said this, there was all due deference to their head of state. But it was clear for them, and they would say it repeatedly, well, yes, he is important, but the system does not rest on one person, whether it's the president who's term limited or even the supreme leader. That one of the things that's interesting and important about the system inside the Islamic Republic, almost like the system inside China, is that both the founding father of the Islamic Republic, Ayatollah Khomeini, as well as Chairman Mao in China, they both bequeathed to their systems, to their countries, not a Western-style democratic system, but a competitive political system that endures beyond personalities. So what I try to bring from my personal experience in talking to so many different Iranian officials and people who live in Iran, support the Islamic Republic, is this idea of the enduring nature of the Islamic Republic, regardless of who's president. So if President Ahmadinejad says something that they don't like or we don't like, the problem is contained in that there will be people who will challenge him the next time around in the next election. So the first thing I do is I draw from my contacts across the spectrum in Iran, which I think is very unique. It will be a unique contribution to the debate. The other is of course, going through our archival material from each of the U.S. administrations dating back from 1979 to document the number of times and the depth of interaction, constructive interaction in many cases, between the United States and the Islamic Republic. So one of the other myths is, well, the Islamic Republic is so radical, so hostile to the United States, and in fact needs the hostility towards the United States to legitimate its own political order. One of the ways that I'm going about, I think, deconstructing that myth and rebutting that myth is to go back and show how every U.S. administration reached out to the Islamic Republic of Iran to cooperate with it in some way, whether it was President Reagan's administration with what we know about Iran-Contra, the Iran-Contra scandal. The first George Bush administration reached out to the Islamic Republic to get Iran's help to secure the release of U.S. hostages in Lebanon. The Clinton administration cooperated indirectly with the Iranians to supply the Muslims in Bosnia with weapons during the Balkan conflict in the 1990s. And of course, the Bush administration that I worked for cooperated with sought Iran's help for Afghanistan and al-Qaeda. In each one of these cases, if you go through all the archival material and you interview people, in each one of these cases of cooperation, it was the United States that cut off the cooperation for reasons that had nothing to do with Iran, for reasons that had to do with our domestic politics for the most part. In each one of these cases, the Iranians delivered not everything the United States asked for, but almost everything. They delivered a lot of what we asked for. It was the United States, though, that cut off each one of these periods of engagement. Going back to Iran-Contra, Iran-Contra failed not because the Iranians didn't come through, but because of a constitutional crisis here in the United States when Reagan administration officials tried to divert the proceeds from selling weapons to the Iranians to fund the Contras in Nicaragua in contravention with U.S. law. So we've had this, this really messy situation on the U.S. side undermine cooperation throughout. So that's the other major area I'll be drawing on.
I am very curious in listening to you to know whether there are any gender barriers when you're talking with Iranian officials. As a woman, did you have any difficulty?
I had no difficulty whatsoever. Okay. I think that inside the Islamic Republic, I think this is one of the other myths, that it's a misogynistic political order. I think this is really a myth. Before the Islamic Revolution, women were able to, of course, walk the streets without their hair covered, and there was this idea of kind of a liberal atmosphere for women. But in fact, many women couldn't really go to school or hold senior government jobs or senior jobs in business or the professions. Now, many of that was, much of that was almost self-selective. Conservative families weren't that interested in having women, particularly from villages and non-urban areas, having their daughters or their wives go to university to mingle, to be with people of the opposite sex, or to be in positions in the office where they're vulnerable in a sense. Now, of course, many women before the Islamic Republic was created did benefit if they were in the elite. But if you weren't in the elite in Iran, if you were a woman and most of the population were not elite, you really had a problem in terms of educational and career advancement. What the Islamic Republic has done is really even the field. So while elite women, of course, can't go out covered, you have to be covered in the streets and in the professions, the system for education and for the professions really essentially opened for the first time to people outside of northern Tehran, which is the most cosmopolitan part of Iran, in a way where if you look at the statistics, the UNESCO statistics and other international statistics in terms of literacy rates and participation of women in many different sectors, the advancement of women over the past 30 years has been strikingly significant inside Iran. I can even tell you from my personal experience of being there, it's, you look out the window and you'll see, you're in a car, you look out the window, that there's a woman driving a minibus. So there are women who, there's women who are ministers in the government, a woman who's driving a bus. At the university, one of the big problems is that there are so many women there. They're concerned that there's going to be such a disproportionate number of women that they will outnumber the men, and they may need to institute an affirmative
goodness,
action,
yeah.
an affirmative action program for men. It also becomes, the Islamic Republic does a lot of very interesting things. One of the other interesting things it's done is it's one of the most advanced countries in terms of family planning. Initially, in the early days of the revolution, the revolutionaries encouraged large families as part of this idea for greater population in the Islamic Republic, but very soon they realized what kind of, the destructive aspects of this for Iranians, for modernization and just for the country. And they instituted a pretty comprehensive family planning program, where the country today, it's pretty easy to get family planning advice and assistance. And there's also a lot of emphasis on things that we've come to relatively late, I think, in terms of embracing women to breastfeed their children, to have places in the workplace to do so. I often travel with my young children, and I find the Islamic Republic is one of the few places where it's easy to bring them, and there's an understanding about women in the workplace also having children and having this balance. I don't say that to say that it's any kind of ideal place. It is not by any stretch, but I don't think there are many places that are ideal. But I think it is a myth that it's a really misogynistic place. There's tremendous room for improvement. I think Iranians of all genders and walks of life are constantly working to make it a better place. There are many, many areas that need improvement. But it's, I think, part of a caricature that just misses a lot of the struggle that women have in all societies. They struggle in Iran as well. But there have also been some very tangible benefits over the past 30 years.
Very good. Let's talk a little bit about some of the findings in your book. I know it's a bit premature and that it's not completed yet, but can you share some of them with us?
I think some of the most important findings are how difficult it will be, particularly on the U.S. side, to really transform the relationship, to come to grips with the Islamic Republic, that it will take a tremendous amount of almost re-education on our parts to really come to terms with what goes on inside the Islamic Republic and to take a really sober look at their foreign policy and national security strategy. The other piece is how difficult it will be to deal with our allies in the region, so that a realignment between the United States and the Islamic Republic of Iran is not perceived as a zero-sum game against our allies. So in that regard, to look at Israel, to look at Saudi Arabia, and one of the important findings is that there's a tremendous amount of concern within Saudi Arabia, within Israel, U.S. allies, of how the U.S. could turn the relationship with Iran. The necessity to do so, now, the necessity to do so takes almost two extremes. The necessity to do so is if the United States could somehow get its act together and figure out a way to deal constructively with the Islamic Republic, very few people in the Middle East think that we can do that. The other extreme is how are we then going to militarily take care of this problem with the Islamic Republic. So those are, I think, the major difficulties of how the United States is going to deal with our allies in the region to make any kind of realignment in relations not a zero-sum game. And so I'd say that's probably one of the most disturbing, most challenging findings in the research so far, is how entrenched views are not only in the United States but in the region in terms of how to deal with the rise of Iran.
Very good. Thanks so much for being here with us today and sharing some of your work.
Thank you very much.
For more information about Professor Leverett and her work, please visit our website at yale.edu/Macmillan Report. Be sure to join us again for another episode of the Macmillan Report, made possible through funding from the Whitney and Betty Macmillan Center for International and Area Studies at Yale.